What did APCO permit between 1957 and 2003? With the help of some friends and researchers, we've gone back and looked at newspaper articles and correspondence over this period of time to get a truthful picture of what Appalachian was doing here at Smith Mountain Lake and how engaged they were or were not in the development of the lake. It'll give you an idea of what the arrangements were that Appalachian made with property owners it sold flowage easements to, and what Appalachian's view of the flowage easement agreement was back when they were first recorded and negotiated. Susan Ramsey wrote for the Lynchburg Living magazine in November 2013 and took a look at the history of the project. Let's study this. You may want to pause the presentation at certain points along the way because the slides are typically busy, but we wanted to get quotes in there so that you could make your own determination as to what Appalachian was thinking back in these days. Mr. Wayne Alexander, he was a real estate agent for Appalachian Power, stated that we primarily acquired our rights through flowage easements. Basically, it gave the company the right to inundate the property up to a certain contour elevation. The property owner retained fee simple ownership, but it was subject to a flowage easement. In theory, they owned what was under the water, and they retained the rights of access to get to the water. Some property owners were unwilling to convey a flowage easement, and in those instances, eminent domain came to play. In those cases, we generally had to go through a condemnation process. AEP had to remove structures, barns, houses, etc. that could later present a navigational problem on the lake. If they didn't, we would go in and clear everything to make sure when the water was raised to the normal level, there wouldn't be an obstruction or any problems. In 1957, the Franklin News Post reported some controversy over the abandonment of bridges across the project and how that was going to interfere with transportation within the county of Franklin. APCO in 1957 stated in this article that they favored buying flowage easements over condemnation or outright purchase of property because it was going to be cheaper to do it that way. And this is what James L. White, the Roanoke District Engineer for Appalachian Power, had to say. On the other hand, we feel that the remaining property owners, that is, those with flowage easements, will be more than compensated by reason of having the most ideal shoreline for recreational purposes on the entire project. In 1959, APCO was briefing the Franklin County Board of Supervisors, stressing how it was their responsibility, the county's responsibility, to regulate the project uses in the lands. He stressed that they need to prescribe regulations in the form of zoning to prevent undesirable structures from being erected that would detract from the value of holdings of other landowners. You'll find that an interesting quote a little bit later on. Just like they lecture us today, they lectured the Board of Supervisors in 1959. You have 2 years to do some orderly planning instead of waiting until the last minute to do panic planning, as is usually done when people suddenly realize the situation that faces them. Well, unfortunately, zoning wasn't passed. In fact, zoning didn't become a reality in Franklin County for another 30 years. In 1964, Appalachian was looking to have the U.S. Coast Guard regulate Smith Mountain Lake navigation and safety. We believe the Coast Guard, jurisdiction over both Leesville and particularly the upper reservoir, commonly known as Smith Mountain Reservoir, would be highly desirable, and we would like to prevail upon the Coast Guard to assume such jurisdiction. In 1966, the Franklin News Post reported that the state officials said, unless you get zoning in place, you're not going to get road funds to build roads to the lake. Bedford and Franklin counties won't get any of the state's new recreational access road funding until they adopt zoning ordinances. Again, I'll remind you, this was in '66. It wasn't until 1988 that Franklin County finally adopted some regulations. In 1967, APCO was just boastful of what they've created here at the lake and boasted of its success. And I'll remind you that they had never issued a single dock permit up to this point in time. D.C. Kennedy, the Roanoke Division Manager for Appalachian, was touting that their early predictions that the reservoirs would create a large market for homes, businesses, and other water recreational-oriented activities. He said that Appalachian's survey did not include estimates on boat docks, boat ramps, piers, and other water facilities unless they were built in conjunction with the dwelling. Again, $2.5 million worth of development, but no need to permit boat docks, piers, ramps, beaches, or other water facilities in the project. 1967, the Franklin News Post reported that 1966 was a banner year for construction. W. Francis Gravely, the Franklin County Commissioner of Revenue, was quoted as saying, "Many permits were also issued for the construction of boathouses and boat ramps. Not a month went by during 1966 that we did not issue several permits for construction along the shores of the lake." Appalachian issued no permits. Appalachian never had an intention of issuing permits. Remember, in 1959, they had advised the Franklin County supervisors to get their act together, zone the lake, and start regulation. They had no requirement to do anything with this lake regarding construction, land use, or the permitting of boat docks. In 1975, the Army Corps of Engineers came to Smith Mountain Lake and declared that they were going to begin permitting boat docks. Where exactly was Appalachian and its flowage easement at this point in time? Because Appalachian had no requirement to permit anything or to regulate shorelines, it had convinced the counties it was their responsibility. It convinced the Coast Guard that lake safety and navigation was its responsibility. And now they were pleased to see the Army Corps of Engineers show up to begin permitting docks on the lake. 1990 comes along, 30 years after the dam construction began, and the Roanoke Times in January of 1990 wrote a couple of articles. The first article, APCO employees profit from inside information. APCO would have gone broke trying to buy every farm bordering the 20,000 acre lake. In many cases, the utility tried to buy only flowage rights. The employees knew which tracts would be the most accessible by county roads and which tracts would have the most water frontage. Inside info, lots of buy-in from APCO workers and from the company itself. The second article appeared in the Roanoke Times on January 8, 1990, entitled APCO Stimulated Development. In actuality, APCO speculated and, using shrewd land management, made millions of dollars selling property around the lake to developers. In fact, they created 4 waterfront subdivisions in the mid-1960s to seed development. APCO had made millions of dollars selling waterfront land that appreciated since the company bought it in the 1960s. In fact, it appreciated so much when AEP went in for a rate increase in 1978, the State Corporation Commission, from complaints voiced by stakeholders, engaged a judge, M. Ray Doubles, to investigate whether or not AEP had authority to engage in land development. Of course, APCO's attorney said, oh no, this had nothing to do with development. This had everything to do with providing electric service. But the commission took no action on this report because APCO agreed to dispose of all the land voluntarily. Well, let's look at how handsomely Appalachian Power benefited from the development of Smith Mountain Lake. Starting in '54, they bought up 5,900 acres near Smith Mountain Lake Gap, anywhere from $10 to $50 an acre. In 1959, they continued to buy land and they continued to purchase flowage rights. They preferred flowage rights because they were cheaper than buying land. They started building the dam in the 60s, and in 1961, waterfront lots had already appreciated to sell for $1,500. $1,500 in 1961 was a lot of money. They continued to buy land between 61 and 73, and they assembled this land into marketable tracts that they could later sell for a very high profit. In 1977, the waterfront lots had appreciated now up to $8,500 to $10,500. APCO, when they were building the project, condemned the area around Contentment Island. They took it through condemnation for project purposes. In other words, it was necessary in order to generate electricity. They condemned more land than what they needed, but that was a good deal for them because they were able to turn around in 1981 and sell that land they condemned at $25 an acre for $900,000. They continued to purchase land all the way through 73 and assembled another 639 acres, which they subsequently sold in 1984 to Ron Willard for $3.4 million so he could develop the water's edge. By 1989, waterfront lots were topping $100,000 in value. Take a look at these employees that benefited from the appreciation of the land around the lake. Mr. Foster, he bought 3 acres for $500 in 1960. He sold it for $8,000 in 63. A J.I. Gilbert Jr. bought 80 acres for $4,100, sold off 11 lots for $40,000, which paid for his entire investment, and still managed to leave his wife $374,000 of land and acreage. Mr. Martin, he was the guy that was in charge of purchasing land around the lake, supervised all the buying of it. He bought a farm in 1958 for $5,000 and sold it for $475,000. We already talked about the Contentment Island tract, which AEP condemned and then sold for a profit. They condemned land they didn't need for project purposes. That is illegal. It was illegal then, it's illegal today. And APCO bought land in 1973, as we spoke earlier, to sell to Ron Willard for $3.4 million in 1984. The common practice prior to 2003 was that APCO issued permits for nothing. Between 1960 and 2003, APCO allowed or encouraged 6,500 residential docks to be constructed on Smith Mountain and Leesville Lake. They also benefited and encouraged development of numerous marinas, and here they're all listed. Virtually every marina on this lake began without an Appalachian permit. And the reason for that is Appalachian had a recreational responsibility, and as long as commercial enterprises would take over and provide access to the lake, that meant APCO had to spend less money providing recreational access. In fact, APCO leased land, 6 sites on Smith Mountain Lake, to the state of Virginia, and the state of Virginia, using grant funds, developed those into what we now know as our free boat ramps around the lake. We again talk about Contentment Island, and they allowed the Contentment Island developer to actually build a causeway, reinforce it, rock it in, build a road, put a gate up in order to get to that island without any permit from Appalachian Power. And maybe the most extreme case here is the Vista Point condominiums at Vista Point. It was called a resort at that time. It was constructed in the middle of the project boundary in Pittsylvania County, and APCO could have cared less. APCO simply viewed the flowage easement as a cost-effective tool to acquire necessary property rights to get their license. Let's review some quotes. APCO would have gone broke trying to buy every farm bordering the 20,000-acre lake. In many cases, the utility tried to buy only flowage rights. In return for agreeing to a flowage easement, the remaining property owners will be more than compensated by reason of having the most ideal shoreline for recreational purposes on the entire project. AEP had to remove structures, barns, houses, etc. that could later present a navigational problem on the lake. If property owners didn't remove it, they would go in and remove it, clear out everything to make sure that when the water was raised to the normal level of 795 feet, there wouldn't be any obstruction or any problems. Well, what changed? Certainly wasn't history. What changed is FERC in 1998 told Appalachian to begin regulating shoreline, regardless if they had the property rights to do so. Appalachian immediately began reading the flowage easements differently than what they agreed to in 1960 when they were negotiated. A very deceptive reading of the flowage easement that says they have the right to clear anything in the project and they have the right to issue revocable licenses. Not true. APCO developed a permit all on its own without any FERC approval or anything else designed specifically to extort your property rights. They misrepresented its property interests to the FERC in both 2008 and 2015 with their drawing submittals, and somehow they came up with this idea that the FERC gave them the federal authority to regulate property they don't own in 2010. Unbelievable. Consider this. Consider all the lands that Appalachian sold to developers and consider how much profit they made. Do you think in any one of those transactions Appalachian said, hey, someday shoreline management is going to become the law of the land and you will have to abide by the shoreline management plan. You will have to abide by all of its terms. You'll have to abide by all of our license terms. You will be applying to us and eventually for dock permits, for beaches. No, they never said anything like that. They sold that land at a premium price, making millions of dollars in speculation, and sold it as waterfront property with unlimited rights to access the waters of Smith Mountain Lake. Well, what company today? Is it the same company? Unfortunately it is, but it's the same company that changed its mind and reneged on all of those deals. History certainly paints a totally different picture than the one Appalachian Power is insisting it has today. Well, here we are at the end again. You've learned a lot about the history of Smith Mountain Lake, accurately history, not somebody's reinvention, by going back to the actual letters and newspaper articles that occurred over time. We need to continue to work together to save our property rights. We need to support C.U.R.B with financial donations. We ask you to continue to open your wallets, support us as the lawsuit that's underway continues to need financing and our educational campaign continues to require additional financing. Thank you so much.